was having a lucky week and won the lot. As a result, I'll read out her letter. Dear Mr President, pursuant to Standing Order 75, I propose that the following matter of public importance be submitted to the Senate for discussion. Prime Minister Turnbull's failure to take action consistent with his words on climate change. Is the proposal supported? The proposal is supported. I understand that informal arrangements have been made to allocate specific times in each of the speakers in today's debate, and with the concurrence of the Senate, I shall ask the clerks to set the clock accordingly. And I call Senator Lyons.
I want to speak on this matter of public importance today on the failure of our Prime Minister to act decisively on climate change. Climate change must be one of the very biggest issues that the whole world is facing, and certainly when Labor was in power, we had a record on climate change to be proud of, absolutely proud of, and yet we now, at least with Mr Abbott, you knew where you stood. He describes climate change as crap, quote unquote, and there was no pretence about where Mr Abbott stood on climate change. But what we've seen with this new Prime Minister, Mr Turnbull, is he's all pretence. He says one thing and does another, or views that he held just a couple of years ago he now no longer holds. So we've really got to dig in and look at what that is really about, and it really is about Mr Turnbull saying what's most important to him is remaining the leader of the Liberal Party and certainly remaining the Prime Minister of Australia, and obviously he will do whatever it takes, including compromising all of his values, to retain that job, because nothing else would really explain the fundamental shift we've seen from Mr Turnbull on the issue of climate change. And I think Mike Seacombe in the Saturday paper really summed it up well when he said, and I quote, "A policy of indirect action may be one way Malcom Turnbull can hang on to the reins of the coalition while keeping his emissions reduction dream alive," end quote. And that, for me, really sums it up, because it says that really what the Prime Minister is doing is he's got a policy of indirect action, and that is absolutely about retaining the job of the Prime Minister, because we all know that 44 members did not vote for Mr Turnbull, and that's a significant group to have against you, and most of those groups, most people in that group are in the extreme right, the people who don't support marriage equality, who don't support the Republic, who don't support climate change, and they're the group that are now have well and truly harnessed the Prime Minister, Mr Turnbull. And it's also worth remembering that the government's adoption of Mr Turnbull, like Mr Howard's adoption of an ETS, was poll-driven, driven by the polls. Certainly the party didn't want Mr Turnbull, and they were forced to accept him, really, because of the disaster that Mr Abbott had turned into, a year and a half of terrible opinion polls, and Liberal Party members knew that they were headed for oblivion if they didn't take some drastic action. And it's a shame that along the way Mr Turnbull lost his taste and his quest for climate change. But that's the reality of it. And because remember, the first time Mr Turnbull lost the leadership, Mr Turnbull lost that leadership because he wanted to take a bipartisan position on emissions reductions. And really, if we are serious about climate change in this country, and we are serious about our contribution to the world's issue of climate change, then it does need to be a bipartisan position. And that was a view that Mr Turnbull was prepared to embrace before he got into the Lodge and before he became the Prime Minister, and that was certainly one of the things that he has sacrificed along the path to be Prime Minister. In fact, that path, Mr Turnbull's journey to be Prime Minister, is just littered with his personal beliefs that he used to hold strewn across the roadside as he made those long strides to become the Prime Minister. And But what we know is that Mr Abbott, in his views on climate change, even though they depart drastically from mine and from the Labor Party, they were views and he was prepared to cling to those views, and ultimately met some of those views, not climate change, brought him down. And as we know, and Mr Turnbull knows full well, that he only won the leadership last year because Mr Abbott had turned into a nightmare in the polls. Australian voters were well and truly sick of Mr Abbott, and in that vein, Mr Turnbull looked and sounded like a breath of fresh air. And the Australian voters welcomed that. But I tell you what, that fresh air has now become almost as polluted as it was under Mr Abbott, because it is very clear that Mr Turnbull is interested in his own power of retaining the leadership of the Liberal Party and of being Prime Minister at all costs, and he's been prepared not just to compromise his values and beliefs, he's sold them down the river. And in Paris, Mr Turnbull completely sold us out, and certainly our leader, Mr Shorten, was there, along with our Shadow Environment Minister, Mr Mark Butler. And again, according to the Saturday paper, there's some detailed analysis conducted by German Watch, the Climate Action Network Europe and other affiliated environmental groups scored Australia third last, not third at the top, third at the bottom, amongst the 58 countries, ahead of only Kazakhstan and Saudi Arabia. That's how low we have stooped in regards to climate change under the leadership of Mr Turnbull. And certainly our Shadow Environment spokesperson, Mr Butler, said that the Global Pact showed Mr Turnbull's policies, including pollution reduction targets and an intention to abolish several climate-related agencies, were massively out of step with the rest of the world. That is where we are now, and Mr Turnbull has taken us there because his quest for power overwhelms any ambitions or beliefs he might have had about changing our climate policy. And certainly there is a clear choice for Mr Turnbull, although at this point he does seem to have made the choice to stick with the right wing, the Tea Party members in his own party. And he has a choice to set Australia up in line with the rest of the world, or to remain at the bottom of the countries at the Paris summit. And let's look at the government's record. In the past 2 years, the government has abolished the price on pollution. It's abandoned an emissions trading scheme. It's slashed the renewable energy target. It's cut funding to carbon capture and storage. It's cut funding to climate change adaptation programs in the Pacific. And it has tried, and it's still committed to abolishing the widely respected and innovative Climate Change Authority. It is also wants to abolish the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And why do they want to do that? Because they don't want the eyes on them. They do not want the eyes on the very poor record, the indirect action of Mr Turnbull and his government on climate change. That's why they want those agencies gone. And if you look at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in particular, we know under Mr Abbott they tried to just push it in the direction of wind farms. That when that failed, they left it alone for a little while, but they have recently confirmed that is still an agency, despite its massive success and the innovation it's been involved in my own state of Western Australia. The wave energy technology, which is really now coming to fruition, was funded by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Labor has never accepted the spurious argument that hanging at the back of the pack, waiting for all the countries to act before we did, was a good policy position, and it is not a good policy position. The science on climate change is clear and it's well established. And so we want to, in government, set up a consultation process to determine our final target, and we want to use the Climate Change Authority's baseline target of 45% reduction to 2005 levels as our starting point. So Labor is out there. We want to look at how we approach an internationally linked ETS, a goal of 50% of Australia's energy generated from renewables by 2030. We have, for the first time in this country's history, put together an electricity modernisation plan. That's never been done before, and it is something that needs to be done. Change doesn't come unless you have good plans and good policies in place, and Mr Turnbull has shown us well and truly he's not interested.
Your time has